So how many of you are familiar with the concept of universal design? So it's a concept that actually originated kind of pre-internet and spoke more so to physical environments. And so Ron Mace, to whom this quote is attributed to, actually used a wheelchair. And so he worked a lot and actually created an organization on universal design. And again, talk more about the physical environment. There have certainly been some offshoots of universal design, particularly universal design for learning. You might hear that term used fairly often. But the concept is still the same in terms of creating, for now, I guess, as it applies to you, is a learning environment that is accessible to students regardless of age or people regardless of age, ability, or status. And so while I've been invited, I think, from the perspective of talking about disability, we also have a significantly growing international population as well, and how universal design is relevant for that particular group. For students who whose first language is not English, universal design can be really helpful in terms of achieving some of the difficulties that students have while they're transitioning here. Universal design is certainly not a cure-all for everything because, remember, the greatest extent possible, it can't certainly fix all of the challenges or the differences that students or other users bring, but it's a great concept to implement. So some of the benefits of universal design. So in our office, we are responsible for facilitating student accommodations. So a student would submit to us either a medical documentation or a psychoeducational assessment determining or making a diagnosis of a learning disability or ADHD, mental health, chronic health, mobility, hearing or speech, visual challenges as well. And the cost is pretty significant. So some of the benefits certainly would be to reduce some of the cost. One of our biggest costs actually is for note-taking, and I'm not sure if any of you have actually had requests for students in your classes who require note-taking. It's probably one of our bigger budget items in terms of facilitating that. The time, of course, that it takes to facilitate accommodations for students in terms of the staff assessment of the documentation, the consultation that sometimes has to happen with professors and other faculty members can be quite time-consuming. Certainly from a big picture perspective, some of the benefits, social justice, so just again, being equitable and accessible for all users of your tools. Some of the more practical benefits of universal design include the scanning optimization. So we have a number of students who have visual impairments or other cognitive impairments. And so when you set up an online learning module, it makes it easier, if, for example, if the headings are quite clear so that they can scan, or if they're using a particular assistive technology. Most of the common ones tend to be voice-to-speech, text-to-speech, text-to-speech, and so it's quite easy if the system is set up to recognize those headings. A lot of students are certainly using Android and iPhones and other tablets, and so when a course is designed for the greatest optimization of all users, again, using some of the assistive technology devices are really useful. And universal design also recognizes learning style differences, and again, as I mentioned, language. So right now we have a population of 13% international students, and that is growing. There's a prediction of 15 in the next year, and as many as 20% of our student population over the next 1 to 5 years. Sure why I'm having my own challenges today. So I just wanted to talk just really briefly about the change in how disability is being perceived. And so typically when a student comes to us, and we're somewhat still using the medical model in that students do in fact, in order to have an accommodation, demonstrate that they have a disability. So again, whether it's a learning disability or ADHD, or a visual impairment, or a hearing impairment. But the medical model suggests that the impairment rests with the person. We are trying to transition more to a social model where the impairment rests with the environment. So again, universal design is intended to address the environmental issues. So an example would be a wheelchair user. There isn't necessarily a disability that the user, a wheelchair user, would come across until they came to a building that didn't have an accessible door. So that's not about the person, that's about the environment. And so those are some of the targets that universal design is trying to address. There, yay! So some of the principles, and this in itself is probably a 3-hour session that I'm going to cover in, I think, the next 5 minutes or so. There are 7 principles of universal design. There's a great workshop that Academic Impressions put on a while ago, and that I'm hopeful that with other members of CLT that we will also be doing probably later in the year. Equitable use. An example of equitable use would be that alternative information is provided along with graphics for visually impaired or auditory learners. So for those of you who might be familiar with BARC, so the learning style, so visual, auditory, read, write, or kinesthetic, providing alternatives to just text would be an example of equitable use. An example of flexibility in use. I've heard some of you talk about online discussions and using discussion boards. The flexibility may be that the discussions are held either in text and or voice. Simple and intuitive. So again, we talk primarily about disability, but also recognizing students' language skills, knowledge. So do you actually link to the article? If you do, it's certainly simple and intuitive, and it would incorporate a principle of universal design. But another example would be that large blocks of text are broken down into smaller components. That headings, again, are clearly marked. So for students who are visually impaired who are using screen readers can easily do scans in the text material. And that if you are using hyperlinks, that they're clearly marked. Or if you have to if a student has to download something, that you're using symbols that are traditionally associated with downloading, or Adobe or Flash or something along those lines. An example of perceptible information in terms of the application. Videos would be captioned, for example, or in terms of the material that you're using, there's sufficient contrast between text and background. I've gone to some presentations where there's a lot of color in PowerPoint presentations or in the text, and not to say that color isn't useful, because certainly it can be, but sometimes the contrast, if you're using a light lavender, for example, it might be very difficult for people, for some to see. Tolerance for error. So a particular application for that would be to associate instructions with the assignment and not necessarily referring students back to the syllabus. So I'm sure you've probably had instances where the student has handed in an assignment, but it's one that's due like 2 weeks from now, as opposed to the one that's due today. And so if you, so that's part of that. Again, that's another application, is just to contain everything in its proper place, more or less. It's also good in terms of an example here, when you can, is to provide an example of an actual correct model. And I know that you can't always do that. But in the instances where that's possible, it might be something to include. As an advisor, one of the things that I do with students when they're preparing for exam is to encourage them to go back and see if there are old exams, on record that they can get and use as a study guide. So that might be another example here. So wrapping up the last two principles, low physical effort. So again, remembering that universal design was thought about largely in the context of environment, and now the applications are being made to learning materials. An application could be represented by having all required readings in one place. That links are provided when students have to use a third-party provider. So Flash, for example, or Adobe, they can do downloads, so it's very clear to them that if they need that particular tool, it's there and accessible. Size and space. And this was really useful for me when I was actually going through some of the previous presentations and your other two sessions, with the fact that I could actually pause for a moment and like pause the presentation and make some notes, which is really important for students to be able to do that, particularly those with auditory processing challenges, for example, or students with ADHD for which concentration might be an issue. They're able to stop and implement some strategies they have for coming back to focus and then go on. Also, another example would be certainly having control buttons for any of your audio, but also making sure that the buttons are large and visible enough for all of your users. You know, and when I say these things, I'm thinking, gosh, they sound pretty straightforward, but you would be surprised at the number of online modules that get caught up in the bells and whistles, as opposed to just having things fairly standard, again, trying to be accessible for all its users. So those are the 7 principles, again, that I would typically cover in 3 hours in 3 minutes. And so just a couple of things for consideration. I would imagine that probably some of this is going to be a bit repetitive in terms of the applications that I had indicated in terms of the principles. But certainly written content is properly structured. So again, I've referenced the headings, but that the block text is broken down. That was one of the things that we recognized when we transitioned our website. So all of the Dalhousie websites are undergoing a transition at the moment. When we transitioned our dal.ca/access website, and even our advising website, there were big chunks of text in every page. And students are certainly open to scrolling, but not after reading a 10-line paragraph. So bullets and lists are really key. Enable dialog boxes to describe images where possible. The instructions are minimized. So if, for example, you want to get a student to go to another link, you don't probably need to put in brackets, click here. It's probably visible enough in either the journal article itself or the text. Again, I've emphasized the headings. I think I can move on from those. And text versions of audio content is provided. Again, there are a number of students who are using various forms of assistive technology. There's a number of wonderful, free, and relatively inexpensive applications for the devices that they're using. Our office actually just purchased a unlimited site license for a tool called Read and Write Gold, and it is a text-to-speech tool. And so we'll actually be doing some workshops on that as well for students and faculty. It's a wonderful, many people are familiar with Kurzweil because it's been around for a bit and it's a fairly popular text-to-speech technology. But in order to use that particular tool, you have to actually be in the Kurzweil program. Whereas the Text Help Read and Write Gold is simply a toolbar that you can put up in your PowerPoint presentation, you can put up on a web page, your Word document, your PDF, and it does the read. You can download any notes that you record into an MP3 file so that you can, listen to it on the bus on the way in. Some other things in terms of when you're creating your online content, That text is in a format that allows for enlarging, and so I'll link that back to PDFs. We have a student we're working with right now who is visually impaired, and we scan all of her books. However, there's one particular class that she's in where it's not a text that they're using, but a number of PDF images, and so it's really hard for her to use her screen reader. Now, we actually have a tool in our office. Well, anyone can have it. It's not a magic one, but you can actually take a PDF and convert it back to Word. So that's what we've done in her instance, so that she can actually use that tool a lot better. The images, when you do try and enlarge, sometimes the text itself becomes a little blurry, so just kind of something to keep in mind. And we've already talked, I think, a little bit about the instructions. So in terms of trying to minimize error, keep everything together so that there isn't any question. And again, it doesn't assume a student's ability, experience, cultural background, expectations. And I think that's it.